You used to hesitate, remember that? Second, guessing every move, waiting for approval, shrinking yourself just to fit into someone else's comfort zone. People got used to that version of you. Predictable, quiet, easy to overlook, and then something snapped. Not overnight, not in some cinematic moment. It was slow, ugly, uncomfortable, the kind of change nobody claps for. You started seeing through the noise, the fake praise, the hidden doubt, the silent competition. You realized the world wasn't testing you. It was measuring how long you'd stay small. So you stopped explaining yourself, stopped asking for permission, stopped playing nice just to be accepted. Now they're confused. They whisper, "What the hell happened to you?" Because they don't recognize the person who doesn't flinch anymore, the one who walks in with intention, not insecurity, the one who doesn't react, calculates, doesn't chase, attracts, doesn't break, adapts. They thought you were growing, but growth is gentle, growth is comfortable. Growth still asks for approval. This is something else entirely. There was a time when every decision you made passed through someone else's approval first. Not always out loud, not always obvious, but it was there, quiet, constant, controlling. You measured your worth through reactions. A nod meant you were doing okay. A smile meant you were accepted. Silence felt like rejection, so you adjusted. You softened your opinions, filtered your thoughts, reshaped your actions just to keep the room comfortable. It didn't feel like weakness back then. It felt like survival. You learned early that being liked made things easier. Less conflict, less resistance, fewer questions. So you became adaptable, agreeable, easy to manage. You studied people more than you studied yourself. You paid attention to what they wanted, what they praised, what they criticized. And without realizing it, you built a version of yourself designed to be approved, not respected. The problem with living like that is simple. Every piece of validation you receive comes with an invisible leash. The more you depend on it, the tighter it pulls. You start hesitating before speaking, calculating before acting. Second, guessing instincts that used to be sharp and certain. You become careful, too careful. Not because you don't know what to do, but because you're waiting to see if it's acceptable. And then comes the moment, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet realization that hits harder than anything else. Nobody is actually thinking about you as much as you think they are. The approval you were chasing, temporary. The opinions you feared, inconsistent. The people you tried to impress, busy living their own lives, changing their standards depending on the day, the mood, the situation. You start to notice the pattern. The same people who praise you one day question you the next. The same voices you trusted for direction contradict themselves, without hesitation. That's when it begins to feel pointless. You look at the effort you've been putting into being accepted and realize it hasn't made you stronger. It's made you dependent. Every move tied to a reaction. Every decision influenced by an expectation. You're not leading your life. You're negotiating it. Something shifts. You stop asking, "Will they like this?" and start asking, "Is this right for me?" At first, it feels wrong, uncomfortable, almost rebellious in a way you can't explain. You catch yourself wanting to go back, to seek that familiar reassurance, to double-check before stepping forward. But you don't. Not this time. You act anyway. The first few steps feel heavy. Not because they're difficult, but because they're yours. No safety net of approval, no guarantee of acceptance. Just your judgment, your instinct, your choice. And when the reactions come, confusion, surprise, even disapproval, you don't collapse the way you used to. You observe it. You process it. But you don't let it dictate your next move. That's new. You start speaking without rehearsing how it will be received. You make decisions without collecting opinions like insurance policies. You take actions that align with your direction, not their expectations. And slowly, something unexpected happens. You begin to trust yourself, not blindly, not recklessly, but with a clarity that wasn't there before. You realize that your instincts were never the problem. They were just buried under layers of noise you were too busy obeying. Now that the noise is fading, those instincts come back sharper, more precise, more reliable. People notice. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. The version of you they were comfortable with starts disappearing. You're less predictable, less reactive, less available for approval-driven behavior, and that makes them uneasy. They don't understand why you're not responding the same way anymore, why their opinions don't carry the same weight, why their validation doesn't control your direction. They try to pull you back, subtle at first. A comment here, a question there. You've changed. What's gotten into you? Why are you acting like this? It sounds casual, but there's pressure behind it. A quiet attempt to restore the version of you they recognize, but that version depended on their approval to exist. And now you don't. You're not rejecting people. You're rejecting the need to be shaped by them. You're not ignoring opinions. You're just no longer controlled by them. There's a difference, and it's one most people won't understand, because they've never stepped outside that system themselves. The moment you stop seeking validation isn't loud. It doesn't come with applause or recognition. It's internal, a decision made in silence that changes how you move, how you think, how you respond. It's the point where you stop performing and start operating, where your actions are no longer a request for approval, but a reflection of control. Pain didn't arrive as something you chose. It showed up uninvited, unpredictable, and at times relentless. Not the dramatic kind people talk about for sympathy, but the quiet, grinding kind that builds under the surface. Disappointments that stacked up, betrayals that didn't make sense, efforts that went unnoticed. You tried to push through it at first, telling yourself it would pass, that things would balance out if you just stayed patient. They didn't. Pain has a way of lingering when it's ignored. It doesn't disappear. It waits. It studies you. It finds patterns in how you react, how you cope, how you avoid. And if you keep treating it like something to escape from, it keeps coming back, sharper each time. At some point, you stopped asking why it was happening. That question never gave you anything useful anyway. No answers, no clarity.
Just frustration.
Instead, something colder replaced it. A different kind of thinking, not emotional, not reactive, calculated. You started observing your pain instead of drowning in it. Every disappointment became data. Every failure became a pattern to analyze. You looked at what went wrong, not to blame, not to complain, but to understand where you hesitated, where you trusted too easily, where you ignored your own instincts. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy to admit, but it was real. That's when pain stopped being a burden and started becoming a tool. You didn't get softer from it. You got sharper, more aware, more precise. The same experiences that used to drain you began to train you. You noticed how certain people operated, how situations unfolded, how outcomes were shaped long before they actually happened. Patterns became predictable. Reactions became manageable. You stopped reacting the way people expected. Before, pain would trigger emotion, anger, frustration, self-doubt. Now it triggered analysis. You didn't explode, you calculated. You didn't collapse, you adjusted. The energy that used to be wasted on feeling was redirected into thinking. Not overthinking, strategic thinking. There's a difference. Emotion makes you immediate. Calculation makes you intentional. And intention is where control begins. You began to realize that pain wasn't random. It exposed weaknesses, gaps in judgment, blind spots in awareness. It revealed exactly where you were vulnerable, exactly where you needed to evolve. And instead of avoiding those areas, you moved toward them, deliberately. You trained yourself to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. To understand it, break it down, reshape it. What used to overwhelm you became something you could dissect, something you could use. The more you faced it, the less power it had over you, and the more power you had over yourself. People misunderstand this part. They think turning pain into power means becoming cold, detached, or emotionless. That's not what happened. You didn't lose feeling. You just stopped letting it control your decisions. There's a difference between feeling something and being ruled by it. You chose control. Now when something hits you, you don't rush to respond. You pause. You observe. You assess the situation for what it is, not what it feels like. You ask different questions. Not why me, but what can I take from this? Not who's to blame, but what needs to change? That shift changes everything, because once you stop wasting pain, it stops being a weakness. It becomes leverage, a source of clarity that most people never access because they're too busy avoiding it. While they're reacting, you're adapting. While they're complaining, you're refining. And that's where the gap forms. They're still trying to escape discomfort. You're using it to evolve. They're still hoping things get easier. You're becoming someone who can handle more. The same pressure that breaks them starts building you. Piece by piece, you become harder to read, harder to predict, not because you're hiding anything, but because you're no longer reacting in ways that make you easy to understand. Your responses are measured. Your actions are deliberate. Your decisions are rooted in something deeper than temporary emotion. Pain taught you that, not in a motivational way, not in a way that feels good to talk about, but in a way that rewired how you operate. It stripped away illusions. It exposed reality, and in doing so, it gave you something most people never develop: control under pressure. You don't chase comfort anymore. You don't expect things to be easy. You don't rely on external stability to stay steady. Because you've already been through instability, and instead of breaking, you learned how to use it. Now pain doesn't slow you down. It refines you. You used to fill every silence like it was a problem that needed solving. The moment things got quiet, you rush to explain, Justify, respond. Words became your shield. If you talked enough, clarified enough, proved enough, maybe people would understand you. Maybe they wouldn't misjudge you. Maybe they'd stay on your side. But silence doesn't work like that. Silence exposes things. It reveals who's uncomfortable, who needs control, who depends on noise to feel secure. And back then, that was you. You thought speaking gave you power, but most of the time, it just gave away your position. Every explanation revealed your intentions. Every reaction showed your emotional state. Every response made you predictable. Predictability is easy to manage. People learned how to read you. They knew what would trigger you, what would make you defend yourself, what would pull you into unnecessary conversations. And without realizing it, you gave them that access. Not because they earned it, but because you couldn't sit still in silence long enough to keep it. Then something shifted. You stopped responding immediately, not as a tactic at first, but out of exhaustion. You got tired of explaining things that didn't need explanation. Tired of arguing with people who weren't trying to understand. Tired of reacting to situations that didn't deserve your energy. So you stayed quiet. At first, it felt unnatural. Almost like you were losing control instead of gaining it. Conversations would pause, and instead of filling the gap, you let it sit. Messages would come in, and instead of replying instantly, you waited, not to play games, not to manipulate, but to think. That pause changed everything. You started noticing things you missed before. The way people reveal more when they're trying to fill your silence. The way they project their assumptions when you don't correct them. The way they become impatient when they can't read you. Silence made you harder to figure out, and that unsettles people. When you don't react the way they expect, they don't know where they stand. When you don't explain yourself, they start creating their own explanations. When you don't engage in unnecessary noise, they start questioning their own words. That's power. Not loud, not obvious, but controlled. You're no longer giving people constant access to your thoughts. You're not revealing your next move through casual conversation. You're not exposing your emotions just to keep things comfortable. You're choosing when to speak, and that choice matters. Because silence isn't empty. It's intentional. It gives you space to observe without interference, to process without pressure, to respond with clarity instead of impulse. You're no longer reacting in real time. You're operating on your own timing. That changes how people interact with you. Before, they expected immediate responses. Now they get measured ones. Before, they relied on your reactions to guide their behavior. Now they're unsure. That uncertainty creates distance, and in that distance, you gain control. You're not ignoring people. You're filtering what deserves your attention. There's a difference. Silence also protects you. It keeps your plans intact, your intentions undisclosed, your thoughts unexposed until they're ready to be expressed. You don't need to announce what you're doing or why you're doing it. You don't need to defend every decision or justify every move. You let your actions speak when they're complete, not while they're forming. That alone separates you. Most people talk too early. They reveal too much before anything is solid. They look for validation in the middle of their process, which weakens it. You don't do that anymore. You build quietly. You move without broadcasting. You let results carry the weight of your voice. And when you do speak, it's different. Fewer words. More precision. No unnecessary explanations. No emotional overflow. Just clarity. Just intent. People listen more because you don't speak as often. Your words carry weight because they're not constant. That's not coincidence. That's control. Silence also tests people. It shows you who respects your space and who tries to invade it, who's comfortable without constant communication, and who needs reassurance to function. You start seeing patterns more clearly, without being distracted by your own need to respond. You become selective. Not everyone gets access. Not every situation gets your attention. Not every comment deserves a reply. And that selectiveness isn't arrogance. It's discipline. You're protecting your focus, your energy, your direction. Because once you understand silence, you realize it was never a weakness. It was something you just didn't know how to use. Now it's part of how you operate. Playing small never felt like a decision. It felt like the safest way to exist. You stayed within limits that kept things predictable, manageable, controlled. You avoided standing out too much, avoided saying too much, avoided doing anything that might draw attention you weren't ready to handle. It wasn't fear in the obvious sense. It was more subtle than that. A quiet agreement you made with the world. If you don't push too far, nothing pushes back too hard. And for a while, it worked. You stayed under the radar. No major risks, no major failures. You learned how to blend in, how to adjust, how to keep things stable. People saw you as consistent, reliable, easy to understand. You didn't threaten anyone. You didn't disrupt anything. You fit into the structure that was already there. But stability has a cost. The more you stayed small, the more you started noticing something uncomfortable. You weren't being challenged. Not really. You were repeating patterns, not evolving. Days started looking the same. Decisions became automatic. You weren't growing, you were maintaining. And maintenance doesn't build anything new. There's a moment when that realization stops being ignorable. It doesn't come with excitement. It comes with frustration. A sense that you're capable of more, but stuck in a version of yourself that's too controlled to act on it. You start questioning your own limits. Not the ones imposed by reality, but the ones you accepted without testing. Why haven't you tried that? Why did you hold back there? Why are you still playing it safe when safe isn't taking you anywhere? Those questions don't feel comfortable. They feel like pressure. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You recognize the hesitation before it even fully forms. The instinct to stay quiet when you have something to say. The urge to step back when there's an opportunity to step forward. And this time, you don't follow it. You pause. You feel that familiar pull toward safety, toward keeping things as they are. And instead of obeying it, you challenge it. Not recklessly, not blindly, but deliberately. You start taking steps that go against that old pattern, small at first, speaking when you'd normally stay silent, acting when you'd usually wait, taking responsibility instead of deflecting it. It feels unnatural, almost forced, because you're stepping outside something you've practiced for so long. But with each step, something changes. You don't break. That's the part you didn't expect. You always assumed that pushing beyond your comfort zone would lead to failure, embarrassment, rejection. Sometimes it does, but not in the way you imagined. It doesn't destroy you. It doesn't end everything. It just teaches you something you didn't know before, and that knowledge builds confidence. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needs to be seen or acknowledged. A quieter form, one that comes from experience, from testing your limits and realizing they weren't as fixed as you thought. You start trusting yourself in situations you used to avoid. You become more comfortable with uncertainty because you've faced it and survived it. The space you operate in begins to expand. You're no longer confined to the same predictable patterns. You start exploring options you once dismissed, taking on challenges you once avoided. Not because you're trying to prove something, but because you're no longer restricting yourself without reason. People notice the shift. The version of you they're used to starts fading. You're more assertive, more willing to take initiative, less concerned with staying in your place, and that can create friction. Not everyone is comfortable when someone stops playing the role they've assigned them. They might question you, push back, try to remind you of who you used to be, but that version was built on limitation. You're not disrespecting anyone by outgrowing it. You're just no longer confined by it. Breaking the habit of playing small isn't about becoming loud or aggressive. It's about removing the restrictions you placed on yourself without realizing it. It's about recognizing that safety became a routine, not a necessity. That hesitation became automatic, not justified. And once you see that, you can't go back to ignoring it. You start catching yourself in real time, noticing when you're about to shrink, about to hold back, about to choose comfort over progress. And instead of letting it happen, you interrupt it. You act not perfectly, not every time, but enough to change the pattern. And patterns, once broken, don't rebuild the same way. You begin to operate with more range, more presence, more control over your decisions, instead of being controlled by habits you never questioned. You stop asking whether you should step forward and start deciding when and how you will. The boundaries that once defined you start disappearing. Not because the world changed, because you did. You used to feel everything all at once. One comment could shift your mood. One mistake could stay in your head for hours. One unexpected situation could throw off your entire focus. It wasn't weakness, it was lack of control. Emotions moved faster than your thinking, and by the time you tried to catch up, the reaction had already happened. You spoke too quickly. You reacted too soon. You let moments decide your direction instead of deciding it yourself. And every time it happened, there was a cost. Not always visible, not always immediate, but real. Opportunities missed because you hesitated at the wrong time. Relationships strained because you responded instead of understanding. Decisions made under pressure that didn't reflect what you actually wanted. You told yourself you'd do better next time, that you'd stay calm, think clearly, act differently. But when the moment came, it repeated, because intention without control doesn't hold under pressure. At some point, you stopped focusing on what you felt and started focusing on how you responded to it. That distinction changed everything. You realized emotions weren't the problem. They were signals, information. indicators of what was happening internally and externally. The problem was letting those signals take over the system. So you slowed it down. Not the world, not the situation, just your response to it. You created space between what happens and what you do next. At first, it felt unnatural. There was an urge to react the way you always had. To defend, to explain, to push back, to shut down. But instead, you paused. You let the emotion rise without immediately acting on it. That pause became your advantage, because in that space, you could see things more clearly. The situation itself, not just how it made you feel. The other person's behavior, not just your interpretation of it. Your own reaction patterns, not just the outcome. You started recognizing triggers before they fully took control. And once you can recognize something, you can manage it. You didn't suppress your emotions. That's a different kind of loss of control. You acknowledged them, understood them, but didn't let them dictate your behavior. Anger didn't turn into immediate confrontation. Frustration didn't turn into impulsive decisions. Doubt didn't turn into hesitation. They became data points. Information you could use to make better choices instead of worse ones. You started asking different questions in real time. Not, why do I feel this? But, what does this mean? Not, how do I react? But, what outcome do I want? That shift pulled you out of the moment and into a position where you could actually direct it. Control isn't about removing emotion. It's about placing it where it belongs. Behind your decisions, not in front of them. That's where outcomes start changing. Because most people are still reacting, still letting their emotions decide the timing, the tone, the direction of their actions. They say things they don't mean, make moves they don't think through, escalate situations that didn't need escalation. You don't. Not anymore. You've seen what that leads to. You've experienced the consequences of acting without control. And once you've understood the pattern, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist. You start operating differently by default. More measured, more precise, more aware. When something challenges you, you don't rush to respond. You assess it. You look at what's actually happening instead of what it feels like is happening. That difference is where most mistakes are made. People act on perception, not reality. You separate the two. That separation gives you an edge. You're not pulled into unnecessary conflicts. You're not distracted by temporary emotions. You're not thrown off course by situations designed to provoke a reaction. You stay aligned with your direction, regardless of what's happening around you. And that consistency builds something stronger than motivation. It builds reliability in yourself. You know how you'll respond because you've trained it. Not perfectly, not without effort, but with enough discipline that your actions aren't random anymore. They're intentional, directed, controlled. People notice the difference. They expect reactions they don't get. They look for emotional responses that aren't there. Not because you don't feel, but because you don't display it the way they anticipate. That unpredictability makes you harder to influence, harder to manipulate, harder to move off your path. Because you're not reacting to them. You're responding based on your own control. That control extends beyond interactions. It affects decisions, timing, focus. You're not rushing into things because they feel right in the moment. You're not avoiding things because they feel uncomfortable. You're evaluating based on outcomes, not impulses, and that changes the results you get. Because when your emotions are controlled, your actions become consistent. When your actions are consistent, your outcomes become predictable, not by chance, by design. You were taught to survive expectations long before you ever questioned them. Do this, be that, stay within these lines and everything will work out. It sounded reasonable, structured, safe, so you followed it. You adjusted your behavior to match what was expected, not what was effective. You learned how to meet standards, how to satisfy conditions, how to avoid stepping outside the roles that were already defined for you. And for a while, it looked like progress. You checked the boxes, met the requirements, did what was necessary to stay on track. People approved. They acknowledged the effort, the consistency, the discipline. On the surface, everything aligned. But underneath, something didn't sit right. Because meeting expectations doesn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes it just means you're good at staying within limits someone else designed. That realization doesn't come easily. You start noticing the pattern in small ways. Decisions you make aren't entirely yours. They're influenced by what's considered acceptable. The paths you choose are already laid out. The risks you take are controlled, calculated to stay within a margin that won't disrupt anything too much. You're not exploring. You're navigating a system built to keep things predictable. Predictability has its place, but it also has a ceiling. You begin to feel it. That invisible limit where no matter how much effort you put in, the outcome doesn't change significantly. You're still operating within boundaries that define how far you can go, how much you can achieve, how much you're allowed to challenge. You're surviving the structure, not breaking through it. And surviving isn't enough anymore. That's when the shift begins. Not loud, not announced. Just a quiet refusal to keep operating the same way. You stop asking what's expected and start asking what's possible. That question changes the direction completely. Because expectations are based on what's been done before. Possibility is based on what hasn't been attempted yet. You start looking at the rules differently. Not as fixed instructions, but as guidelines that can be tested. You question why they exist, who benefits from them, and whether they actually apply to where you're trying to go. Some of them make sense. Most of them don't, and the ones that don't start to feel less like guidance and more like restriction. So you step outside them, not recklessly. Not without awareness, but with intention. You take actions that aren't pre-approved. You move in directions that don't come with guaranteed outcomes. You stop waiting for confirmation that you're on the right path and start defining that path yourself. That's where things change. Because once you're no longer confined by expectations, your decisions are no longer limited by them. You're not choosing between options that were given to you. You're creating options that didn't exist before. That's not survival. That's control. People notice the difference. The version of you they understood was easier to categorize. Predictable. Manageable. Now you're making moves they didn't anticipate. Taking risks they wouldn't take, ignoring standards they still follow. That creates confusion, sometimes resistance. They question your choices, not always directly. sometimes through doubt, sometimes through subtle comments, sometimes through concern that sounds genuine but carries hesitation underneath. They don't see the full picture. They're still operating within the same expectations you stepped away from. So from their perspective, you're going off track. But from yours, you're finally on it. You're not chasing approval anymore. You're not measuring success by how well you meet someone else's criteria. You're defining your own metrics, setting your own standards, holding yourself accountable to outcomes that actually matter to you. That changes how you move. You're not waiting for permission, not delaying decisions until they feel safe, not adjusting your direction to fit into something that was never designed for you in the first place. You're operating with a different mindset entirely, one that prioritizes impact over approval, because expectations are built to maintain systems. Domination comes from understanding those systems and deciding when to operate within them and when to move beyond them. You're not rejecting structure. You're controlling how it applies to you. That control gives you freedom, not the kind that removes responsibility, but the kind that increases it. Because now the results are yours, the wins, the losses, the outcomes. They're all tied to your decisions, not someone else's framework. There's no one to credit, no one to blame, just you. And that level of ownership changes how you approach everything. You think differently, act differently, decide differently. You're not just trying to keep up anymore. You're setting the pace, not reacting to what's expected, but defining what happens next based on what you choose to execute. That's the difference between surviving expectations and dominating reality.